Welcome back, ladies and gentlemen, to another episode of the Classical Antiquity Sidequest, a podcast covering topics from classical antiquity. The period of time is known for, as Edgar Allan Poe put it, the glory that was Greece, the grandeur that was Rome. Our next side quest will take us into our first movie review. And given the number of films that are based on events, loosely or strictly, emphasis on loosely in this case, from the classical antiquity period, we should be able to do a lot of these. And today we'll be reviewing the film 300, based upon events at Thermopylae during the Greco-Persian Wars. Brief summary, the film follows Xerxes' invasion of Greece from the Spartan perspective. We see the attempt of King Leonidas of Sparta and soldiers from a few other Greek cities to try and hold off the Persians at the pass at Thermopylae. Greatly outnumbered, the Spartans hold out courageously, loving freedom at every moment while ruled by a king until the very end. And that, as we, I guess, get into, and our next guest and I were talking about this off the record, maybe you see more of it later. The idea is that buys the Greeks enough time to rally a force to defeat the invaders. Well, I've been a little negative. I actually enjoyed this movie very much when I watch it because it's just entertaining, and we can talk more about that later. Our guide for this side quest is Victor Lamas, who we remember from our first side quest, which was about Alexander the Great. Victor, how are you, sir?
I'm doing really well. Thanks for having me back.
Thanks for coming on. Are you ready to talk about Zack Snyder's big first hit, 300?
I am. I am. I was really excited when I saw trailers for this movie. And I'd read the Frank Miller comic book, right? I'd grown up. I mean, Frank Miller, if you're a comic book person, he's kind of one of the legends, right? The Dark Knight Returns, all his stuff with Batman and Elektra and Daredevil. He's kind of a genius artist and genius comic book writer. And so he came out with this graphic novel about the Battle of Thermopylae, which very Frank Miller-y. I enjoyed most of it. I mean, I like the graphic novel. Some of the quibbles that I have are things I don't like about the movie I didn't like in the graphic novel. The graphic novel, and then Zack Snyder. We know Zack Snyder. Obviously, he's done a lot of film work. DC, I guess, whatever, Warner Brothers gave him the keys to the DC ship a while back, and I don't know if it worked out. It didn't really work out. He also did Watchmen, some other movies. I think he has a couple movies on Netflix that I've not watched.
Rebel Moon.
Right. He has his style, right? He is unabashedly, he's kind of like, what's that? I mean, he's kind of like that Wes Anderson guy. I mean, he's going to stick with what he wants to do and his style, no matter what.
A lot of slow motion. I actually thought his take on the DC movies got a raw deal due to studio interference. But I also think if he had sped up and cut out a lot of the slow-mo scenes, particularly like the beginning of Watchmen, for example, which I enjoyed, but there are moments in there where you're saying, sort of like in this movie, but this was the first time he did it, and it was a short movie, so it didn't really bother you. But one of the things that's great about action scenes is the tempo and the speed, and just kind of go at a quicker pace. Like one of the best fight scenes ever was in From Russia with Love, in the train, and that was not slowed down and put in slow motion. That's part of why it was so good. But we could go on. I could go on for a long time about how that drags movies out. I saw this movie when it came out, and I really enjoyed it the first time I saw it. It was action-packed. It was really quick. I think I had just read the novel about it, not the comic book, Gates of Fire. Right. I think I had recently read that in law school and enjoyed the book. We can talk more about that later. It was fantastic. I enjoyed this movie because it was just, I thought, action, action, action. And entertaining action. And that's what I enjoyed about the movie. And it did, having just read part of Herodotus's The Histories, it did incorporate some what we understand to be actual events that occurred in this. And I thought it was a good mix of that. What were your thoughts when you first saw the movie?
So I saw it in the theaters too in 2006. I was really excited for it, and when I watched it, there were parts of actually I think I enjoyed the movie as well. Uh, it's always for me being a history nerd, it's always thrilling when when they take an event from history, especially the kind of history that I really liked learning about and reading about, and they put it on the screen. So in some ways, you know, I'll take it any way I can get it. And I really enjoyed this movie when it came out. Upon first blush, I enjoyed the action scenes. I enjoyed the lines. I thought the guy, Gerard Butler, I thought he played a good Leonidas. And it was also to connect it back to the Frank Miller graphic novel. It was cool to see some of the things that are in drawings, right? And Snyder, I thought, did a really good job in a couple instances of portraying an iconic sort of scene that had been drawn in a comic book, and you see it in motion on the screen. That movie, I think, was also influential in that it led to a bunch of other sort of similar style movies, right? Not just the sequel that wasn't very good, but that kind of idea of heavy green screen and just using green screen to play around with anything that you wanted. I mean, besides the Star Wars prequels, right? But that stylized thing, I think the movie was influential for a while because of that style that Zack Snyder used in there to comic book eyes it,
Yeah, and you were kind enough to loan that to me, which I read before we did this episode. And I thought, in particular, the scene with the oracles was a very good adaptation of what had been put together by Frank Miller.
Mm-hmm.
I thought that they did that very well, and it was very effective. The cast was good, but I have to say this, and I'm just going to call him by how I refer to him in my mind because I first saw this actor playing Jimmy McNulty on The Wire. I think they wasted McNulty in
Yeah.
the movie. Instead of him being the scheming politician, he should have been on the front line and a soldier. He's just too good of an actor to waste.
And he looks like one, right? They always, there's a couple actors. I mean, I've seen them all. I've seen Troy, Alexander, and they use these guys. Actually, they use these guys all the time. Hey, you look like someone who would fight in some ancient army. Kind of like how they used a lot of the same extras in Game of Thrones, right? These same Irish working class guys that had beards that then season after season of Game of Thrones, they would just go ahead, get their season 2 jacket, season 3, and then have some laughs. They always have the same sort of cast of ancient battle warrior looking guys. There's another actor in there, Michael Fassbender, who obviously is a very good actor as well. And then of course Lena Headey, who plays Leonidas's queen. She was Cersei Lannister in Game of Thrones. Yeah, you're right. They should have picked someone who looks smoother instead of him, right? More
Yeah.
wide.
Yeah, and Zack Snyder does have a history of miscasting people. For example, I think Bryan Cranston was in consideration to play Lex Luthor in the DC Extended Universe. I've
Oh my
heard that
gosh, who
rumor.
they get instead?
I know. And I mean, he would have been such a great Luthor that
Yeah.
that so anyway, that we all have our weaknesses, we have our strengths, but that was a mistake. I also, the McNulty, Dominic West is his real name. His character was fictional, and I'm sure they could have found a real person to base that on that he could have been a stand-in for or whatever. We can get into the accuracy of the movie later, but I think you and I have talked about this to some extent. These stories in and of themselves are so good naturally. You
Great.
don't really have to make things up. just to fill time.
Right. Yeah, that subplot in some ways, if that subplot was probably unnecessary, um, to the movie. And that gets back to another thing that whatever the movie's imperfections, the theme is a worthy one to put on the screen, right? The theme of fighting against overwhelming odds, the belief and the values expressed in, at least in the movie, of, wanting to be free, fighting against possible invasion or domination, all of those ideas are, again, they're great to see portrayed on screen. People willing to give their lives for a belief, an idea, a value, or their comrades is always that's always a good thing to see on screen, rather than sometimes it's a good antidote once in a while to movies that are just nihilistic in their values, even if they're entertaining to watch, right? I like, and I watch my nihilistic sort of shows, right? But then once in a while, it's good to have, it's good to have stories of values and good versus evil in that sense, as well.
Right. And just so everybody knows, the subplot that we were talking about was McNulty's character has sold out to the Persians and he's going to betray Sparta. And there's no way to gloss over this. He rapes the queen and she does get her revenge upon him. And what was, I will admit, a very cool scene, the way that she did it. In the Spartan meeting house, or I guess what would be similar to their Roman Senate that they had.
Right.
And that was a really well done scene, I thought, the way that she got her ultimate revenge. And to your point, it's a tremendous story, which is why so many people come back to it. But why don't we talk a little bit about the history behind the events as they're portrayed? So why don't you just talk us through, from a historical perspective, what the movie, well, why don't you first start by telling us, why are the Persians and Greeks at war at this point? What is happening? And then we can go into what the movie got right and maybe what it missed on.
Sure. So when we talk about Greece, it wasn't really the Greeks were a collection of independent city-states, right? And they fought against each other, they squabbled with each other, even though they had somewhat of a collective culture and language. So 20 years before the events of the movie, right, the Battle of Thermopylae, which was a defeat for the Greeks in reality, 20 years before, this all started because the Persian Empire at that time was the largest empire known to man, right? It had been created and it had been expanded by Cyrus, and then it's probably its greatest king was Darius, and they had conquered all of much of the known world, at least to the west. And there were these Greek city-states on the west coast of what is now Turkey, right? Known to them as Ionia, right? To the Romans as Anatolia or Asia Minor. And one of those cities rebelled against their Persian overlords. Actually, for somewhat, funny reasons. It wasn't all freedom and, overthrow the yoke kind of thing. But they rebelled, and the Athenians helped them, right? The Athenians sent a small group, and the Athenians said, yeah, this is fun. And they burned either all or portion of a Persian city that was sort of their regional capital, right? To oversee everything in that area. I think it was Sardis. And then the Athenians went home. And so Darius, the great king or emperor of the Persian Empire, he sent an army of about 30,000 to punish the Athenians for what they had done. And the Athenians, they landed on the plains of Marathon, right? Maybe you all know that story. And 9,000 Athenians and 1,000 Plataeans defeated an army of 30,000 on the plains of Marathon. And then the runner dispatched and ran 26.2 miles, right, to Athens to give the message. And then the Athenians won lots of glory at that battle, but the Persians, Darius vowed to, okay, well, this time I'm just going to send my whole army and I'm going to conquer not just Athens, but all of the city states in Greece. And then he died, and then there was his successor, and there was a contested successorship. And then finally, Xerxes came out, and he had to put down some rebellions, new great king and all. And then finally, right, finally, 10 years after that, so now we're in, year 20 since the Athenians helped this rebel city burn down. It took him like 3 years to gather up this vast army, right? Either 300,000. Herodotus says it was something like 5 million, which no, that would have been impossible to supply.
Yeah.
But it was still the largest army gathered at that time. And they made their way. They crossed, they made a bridge across the Hellespont, right? A bridge of boats. And I mean, this bridge that the Persians constructed to get across, I think it was like several miles, right, across the water. It was said that just the ropes binding the ships together were so incredible that they remained behind, and the Athenians and Greek tourists would come and just to view the ropes of this bridge. And so they crossed through, and the city, the Thracians, many Greek city-states included, or kingdoms, including the Macedonians, gave earth and water to the Persians, said, we accept your hegemony. And they marched through. If I remember, I think even the city of Thebes, right, another famous Greek city-state, gave hegemony to acknowledge the Persians, and they kept coming. And the Persians, as they kept coming, the Greek city-states, many of them below, Greece is like sort of in two parts, right? It's the northern part, and then there's this little strip, this little land bridge called the Isthmus, right? And then below that is called the Peloponnesus, right? And as they're approaching, many of the Greek city-states thought that they squabbled, but they thought they could make they could make a stand and hold them back through this little strip of land, and to march through. Greece is very mountainous, right? That, maps often don't show you that. And there would be this one narrow part, like a narrow road, mountain on one side and sea on the other, and a cliff, where it would be possible to bottleneck a vast army. While the other Greeks had time to gather up their forces, whatever they could, to repel what still would have probably been a sure defeat. The Athenians themselves had, years before, they had found this silver mine, like literally won this lottery in the sense they found the silver mine, and they wisely decided to spend it not on giving all the Athenian citizens shares, but to spend it on building a fleet. And so, because the Persian fleet itself, right, this army was so big, it had to march near the water, so a fleet could basically sail along the shore near it to simply supply this big Persian army. And when we talk about this Persian army, what we're really talking about is some Persians, and then also all of their conscripted auxiliaries from all parts of their empire, Egypt, Afghanistan, Lydia, all sorts of places, Mesopotamia. And so there at the Hot Gates, Thermopylae, near there were 2,000, I think to some accounts, 2,000 Greek soldiers, of which the most famous ones, and often the only ones mentioned, were the 300 Spartans, but there were others as well. And right. That's the perfect place for the Greek battle hoplite tactics to hold back a big army.
Yeah, and the reading Herodotus's account of this was very good for people who may have the book. It's in book 7. It was very readable, very well told. One thing that I thought was interesting before we get into a little bit more maybe about what the movie did well and didn't do well was that Herodotus pointed out some of the delay in the invasion with the transition of the king was Darius had to name his successor before he could leave. And that had slowed him down because there was a dispute. And there's a very interesting, I would think, largely fictionalized account of who said what to whom.
Right.
But one of the more interesting thing is that some of the Greek soldiers that are in his army, because it's a very multinational force,
Right.
are trying to tell him, you don't want to mess with these people, just stay away. And they don't listen to him. And he goes on, and he sort of had a little bit of Caesar in him, right? There's a line that he says, only by great risks can great results be achieved. And
Yeah.
it did not work out. But we can discuss a little bit more about that later. Now, one thing onto the movie, I thought it kind of got the overall concepts well. But one of my biggest gripes about the movie, and I'd like to get your point on this, is and I'm going to mispronounce his name as it is, but the traitor, the Greek traitor, the kind of Quasimodo fellow.
Right.
They said, "Well, look, man, we would love to have you in our army. We'd love to have you as part of what we do." I, I'm going to botch the pronunciation of his name, so I won't do it. But he said, "But we fight. We fight in a very, very specific formation. Okay, you have to be able to fight in the phalanx, and you see maybe two segments where they're in the phalanx." And other than that, it's like one-on-one, loose fighting. The one guy gets his head chopped off because he's not paying attention and he's out of formation. And I'm just like, okay, maybe that's where you build in the McNulty
Right.
subplot a little bit more differently. I thought that
Yeah.
they could have done a better job displaying the historical manner in which they fought. Not that these action scenes aren't great and entertaining. I mean, I think that's real, but I thought that was one of the real strengths of the movie. But when they kick him out over that issue, I just kind of said to myself, really?
The movie, though, actually, to me, my favorite part of all the scenes in the movie is the initial when they're in basically a phalanx or a shield wall, and the Persians just, the Imperial Persian army rushes, and then they got to hold this vast onslaught with their shields. That that to me was I thought that was very well done, and it gave you the sense of the sense of what it must have been like to be in one of those big, enormous shoving matches, right? These shields, their armor, in reality, with people pressing up against you, especially if they fought other Greeks in the same formation, it was a terrifying, probably just a big shoving match, and you had to hold tight. And the whole point of all that drill, the whole point of what made the Spartans hard to beat for centuries in their neck of the woods was because they drilled in this style of fighting, this tightly knit, right? Your one shield overlaps the other shield or the side of your buddy's body to protect him as well. And the moment you break out of that, then you're in danger. And so by its own logic, right? Exactly. I think the traitor's name, the way I pronounced, was Ephialtes.
I think that's right. I'm always afraid I'm going to get something like that wrong. And we can talk about his portrayal and what Herodotus said about him
And
later. But yeah, Ephialtes.
what's fun, I liked the way in the movie and in the graphic, I liked it. They fleshed out his story, and they made him right. They made him into in some ways, a tragic character that you wish something better had happened, right? That maybe deserved a little bit more compassion from Leonidas, right? But you're right. In the movie, then many of the scenes they abandon their phalanx formation, and it's a lot of just sword swinging and of the kind that frankly, of the kind that you see in any other movie, right? It would have been nice to have seen. I think the modern audience, I think the audience today would be excited to see what that might have been like. You don't need long action scenes in a movie, right? There's that, yeah, as you mentioned, From Russia with Love. You just need it well done. For example, take just real quick, people thought, oh my gosh, in the Revenge of the Sith movie, right? A 20-minute battle between Obi-Wan Kenobi and Anakin with lightsabers. How great is that? It wasn't great. It got old after a while. Whereas you contrast that with, a short but thrilling battle between Luke Skywalker and Darth Vader in Empire Strikes Back, for example, right? You just want things to be well done. And in this, I wish they'd have done more with the phalanx, because that was, in some ways, that was the whole point of how they were able to hold this Persian army back. Because once you break formation, doesn't matter how skilled you are, right? If you're outnumbered, then masses of people can shove in through those gaps, right? And they can just, it's like they breach it, and thus they can break you apart. The whole point is to hold your formation, because in any of these battles, the folks that break formation then often break and run.
Right. And you lost some of the generalship element of it by just showing it as, oh, these are just great one-on-one fighters at times. You don't really see the strategy that had to go into fighting, because if you got outflanked in a phalanx, you were dead.
Right.
That was the weakness to it. So I wish, to your point, we could have seen some more of that. But again, the action scenes I thought were very well done, even the inaccurate ones. But just so everybody knows, Ephialtes was a real character according to Herodotus. And I do have to beef a little bit with Herodotus, because he promised to tell us what ended up happening to him and why it happened. And he left out one possible reason for the revenge that was taken upon him later. He just never came back around to it, which also Herodotus says he knows the names of all the 300. And I'm reading the book and I'm like, great, he's going to list them all out here. And then he never does. And I said to myself, that would be like you and I doing a podcast episode about the moon landing, the first moon landing. And then at
Right.
the end, you tell me about what a great dude Neil Armstrong was. And you're like, sorry, we're out of time. I can't get into that now. And you just, I just read that and I said, how did you leave that out of the book, man? How did that happen?
I wonder if, he is the father of history. I wonder if, because a lot of these things were read out loud, right? I wonder if maybe that was in his annotation somewhere, and but maybe he did. And then he would read them out loud. And finally, whatever person paid him to sit there and read this thrilling story by name 130s, probably snapped his fingers like, all right, let's move it along, man. Right.
Right.
And so
Right.
maybe he cut the names out just because it was making for boring, recitation at dinner parties. Um, we know some of the names, right? We know some of their names of these Spartans. I think the most famous one was Dionysius, who was one of the 300, and he gets some of the best. Herodotus and others give him some really great lines, about "we'll fight in the shade," right? That's a great line. The arrows have what the Persians have so many arrows, archers, that when they fire all their arrows, it'll blot out the sun. And the famous quip by Dionysius is, well, then that's good because we get to fight in the shade, right? Instead of the hot sun, something like that.
Right. And I was glad that that got in there, as well as the Spartans pushing the messenger, the Persian messenger, into the well. And
Right.
also the fact of the betrayal itself was historically accurate about how the Persians found their way around there. So those were some of the things that were got correct, as well as, of course, the end that didn't change. They all died, right? So they got that right. But what did you think that the film missed on? What did everybody whiff on that maybe, if you had a second chance, you could go back and fix if you were to do it as part of like a 10-part miniseries?
Um, like in terms of the details, gosh, now that I think about, a lot of the quibbles, a lot of the complaints out of the movie, I guess, is just some of the stylized stuff, the way they portrayed the Persians. Um, I definitely, um, they got the basics right, and there's some things they could have included. I'm trying to remember in the movie, for example, after the battle, Xerxes ordered that Leonidas's body be beheaded and then crucified. I don't think they had that in the movie or in the graphic novel. Um,
They picked up on that with the sequel with the beheading.
Okay. Uh, Again, that movie, as you and I both agree, that movie's so terrible. I think I've just blotted it out from
Ugh,
memory.
not good. And
Um,
the portrayal of the Persians in that was worse than here, which we can talk about.
I I think in terms of the history, there's a danger there. I mean, because with a movie that you want under 2 hours, you have to simplify. You do have to simplify. You got to get your characterization in. Um, so they had to break it down to its basic elements. So in that regard, I can't ask the movie to stuff in more history, right? That would be confusing to. I mean, and again, this movie is made for people who aren't history nerds, right? And so it's designed for them. I can't ask the movie to include too much historical detail that would, might cause confusion, or people say, why are we wasting time with this? Um, my quibbles are, I mean, big one is the fighting. The other one is the way the way the Persians are portrayed. Some of them, Xerxes himself, for example, in the movie he is portrayed, and in the well, it's actually Zack Snyder taking Frank Miller's portrayal in the graphic novel. He's portrayed in a very bizarre way, um, almost, I don't know, almost like some sort of alien or something, right? I found that off-putting myself. If I had been Iranian, right, from Iran, you know, sitting in the theater, I think I would have been very offended. Um, the Spartans were portrayed. The Spartans were portrayed in some ways. I didn't find Leonidas, for example, in that movie to be. I found him a likable character, but I didn't. I mean, he also was. He was very Spartan in the sense that he also had sort of a merciless attitude. Uh, about killing and the way he treated Ephialtes. And in that sense, that was very Spartan. I mean, we talk about the irony, of course, is this event is treated as, and I agree with the way it's treated, but it's West versus East, right? Western civilization, right, could have died if the Persians had conquered Greece. The glories of Athens would not have happened. Philosophy, politics, democracy, etc. The irony, of course, is the Spartans, not only were they ruled by a king, they were ruled by two kings, is the reason they were Spartans. And they were, and throughout Greece, I mean, Spartans, they didn't have art except maybe a little bit of poetry. They sung a little bit, but they had no philosophy. They had nothing. Everything was subjugated to a sort of totalitarian equality of state. And this was done. The reason they gave themselves such harsh training, right, at the age of 7, pulled away from their moms, and basically, I mean, the Sardaukar from the Dune novels are inspired by the Spartans, is because when these Spartans originally conquered Greece, right, they were northern Greeks that came in and conquered Messenia. They turned all those Greeks, those Messenians, into helots, so basically serfs, slaves. And they would occasionally encounter slave revolts from these people. So in order to keep these slaves down, because they were outnumbered by them, is they devoted themselves to military training. So it was, I mean, so their Spartanness, which we admire from afar, was in reality was based on, we have so many slaves that we have to be tough enough to defeat them every time they rebel and revolt. So it was, their training was done to keep their own Greek slaves down. And that's, I mean, that's another irony, of course, that is not once mentioned in this movie or in 300, where that comes from, where their toughness comes from.
Yeah, and I think to your point about the Persians, the when I first watched the movie, I just kind of viewed it as we're just telling it more. And the first time I watched it to get ready for this too, it was just being told from kind of the way the Greek historians would tell it, kind of this Greek perspective of it's our
Right.
team. We're going to pump up our team. But I thought the Persians did get a bad rap because that was as you said, a huge empire. It was multi-ethnic, and it started to develop a lot of what you would later see in even the Roman Empire with governing structures, right?
Right.
With how you administered a complicated machine like that. And so the idea of these mystics and they're just, they tried their magic and not all that stuff. I understand you're trying to get the locals fired up to fight with you, but and Xerxes too, his portrayal in the sequel was even weirder than this. I just thought you could find a way to just say, and maybe if you cut out that McNulty subplot that we talked about and you do a little bit more time from the Persian perspective, you could present him, the king, as a warrior and this was in Herodotus where there was a lot of doubt about, am I going to go through with this or not? And then he feels like kind of he has to, right?
Right, because yeah, Leonidas, there was that prophecy, right? That in order for Greece to survive, a king must die. Um, there could have been a subplot because if I remember my Herodotus on this, there was a Spartan king in the Persian court. You could have created, I mean, it wouldn't have been any more historical and inaccurate than other things, historically inaccurate than other things. You could have had that Spartan king come with Xerxes, right? And you could have created that sort of subplot as between brothers, right? Or between, two kings. Um, there,
Right. And I found it. It's page 475. Demaratus, I may be pronouncing that wrong, and he's asked by Xerxes, what do you think about my plan? You're Greek. Tell me what you think's going to happen. And he says, can I tell you the truth? And Xerxes says, yes, go ahead, tell me the truth. And well, that's one of the things I liked about the Herodotus version of this is you get a much more comprehensive portrayal than you got in the movie, which I understand. Weird that this was actually a short movie, certainly by Zack Snyder standards. It would be a novella, but he says, look, I think highly of all Greeks of the Dorian lands, but what I'm about to say will apply not not to all Dorians, but to the Spartans only. First, then, they will not, under any circumstances, accept terms from you, which would mean slavery for Greece. Secondly, they will fight you even if the rest of Greece submits. Moreover, there is no use in asking if their numbers are adequate to enable them to do this. Suppose 1,000 of them take the field, then that 1,000 will fight you, and so will any number greater than this or less. That would have been, I think, a very good story that you could have included, and maybe
yeah,
that could have been McNulty's character, right?
right.
That would have portrayed the Persians in a more accurate light and b a less jingoistic light and bizarre at times. So I don't know. I mean, nobody asks my opinion on these things, not even now. But uh, so let's talk a little bit more about maybe why it is that this incident, because it seemed like, so they're coming up to the battle. This is one thing maybe we can lead into this with. You're coming up to the scene of the battle, and it seems like, in historically speaking, the Greeks who get there are like, okay, we can hold them off for a little bit, and we will be able to buy some time, right?
Right.
And that'll rally an army, and then it turns into, well, we're not getting out of here alive. Was it sort of this accidental nature of it? Was it maybe the brutality of all the way that these people died, or just what do you think it is that turned this moment into such a significant historical event that we all remember?
Part of that is the first thing that we talked about was, you know, um, people willing to give their lives for a cause greater than themselves. For sure, it helps that it was written about. The Greeks themselves, from the get-go, recognized that. Again, I mean, technically, the Battle of Thermopylae was defeat, right? They were killed, and the Persian army marched on and burned Athens. But the fact that people are willing to give their lives even in a futile cause as an inspiration for others. I mean, part of that is also that it inspired the rest of the Greeks. It inspired the Greeks, the Athenians, for example, and then a year later, all the Greeks that fought in a huge Greek army to defeat the Persian army. It was a rallying cry, right? You know, you have in American history, you have something like the Alamo, right, which was a defeat, but it is still remembered as a glorious part of, Texan and American history, and then it, inspired the later victory at San Jacinto. Um, that a king, right? That a king, a Spartan king, is dying there, dying there with his men, right? I mean, there's a reason, I think, for example, the really good novel Gates of Fire, it's beautifully written, but also it's written in such a way that it is inspiring. It's inspiring enough that, the U.S. Marine officer, part of their training is it's required. That novel is required reading, right? The novel, the fictionalized account of this battle. I mean, they left poems, they left monuments behind, right? Soon after this battle occurred. And then, of course, once, in European and Western history, once this stuff was sort of rediscovered during the Renaissance, it became a symbol of an outnumbered Western civilization, right, fighting against was perceived, right, as an Eastern and either a barbarian or a menacing sort of onslaught. And it had its parallels I mean, it was in the 1500s and the 1600s, and by then the Ottoman Empire, right? The Ottoman Empire, in that sense, was the new Persian Empire, right? Vast armies, always trying to push into smaller Europe, right? A collection of small kingdoms to conquer it. So the Battle of Thermopylae, just as, the Renaissance was inspired by the rediscovery of Greek and Roman values, culture, history, etc. Thus, this battle also it was rediscovered, and of course, it sort of became cultural and political for later, European historians, right? Because again, you had your parallels with the Ottoman Empire. Again, I mean, when in the 1800s, when the Greeks won their independence against the Ottoman Empire, right? Many Englishmen whose education was classical, right? Part of their education was learning the classics, like Lord Byron, right? They were inspired by the Battle of Thermopylae and the Persian Wars to go down there and fight with Greek rebels in the 1820s. You have I remember when this movie came out, or actually in the forward, there's a I mean, he's conservative in his political beliefs, but he also writes a lot of history, named Victor Davis Hanson, and he wrote a forward to that, and he brought up that he said the graphic novel, plays, it takes some liberties, but at heart, what this is a defense of Western democracy, Western Enlightenment values, right? And that's what makes this story important.
Yeah, and it's such a compelling story. It's easy to see why people latch onto it. I would like to see, though, and maybe Hulu or Netflix or somebody can do this, a really good story from both the Greek and Persian perspective. Because when I read Herodotus, I was really impressed by the way that he recounted the Persian side of things.
Mm-hmm.
And I thought you could have a really good story there that you could tell. So somebody who's got a connection to a streaming service, make that happen. It would be a very, very, very interesting watch if you cast it right and do it right. So we've gotten through this for quite a bit now. We haven't even said this is Sparta yet. We haven't yelled that out. That's the biggest line, I think, in the movie, probably its most famous thing aside from the fight scenes. You've mentioned this a little bit. We've mentioned a couple of the big sources, but if we want to learn more about this battle, more about this war, where should we turn to get? And that was one thing that was in the graphic novel that had some suggested further reading. But where should we turn for some good books on this to learn more?
Okay, so primary sources, Herodotus is there. There's a wonderful website called livius.org. And it has for free, it has everything. I mean, it has everything for free. That's where I found Herodotus again. It has maps. It's a wonderful website. It's used by a lot of historical fiction writers, right, to find primary sources. Livius.org. I think that's it. One of the I mean, Herodotus is the most. I mean, if you want to get the first primary source of this, you got to read Herodotus. There are other sources. Plutarch. If you want some wonderful reading about the ancients, Greeks and Romans, Plutarch's Lives is a wonderful. I've reread his stuff over and over again. I love his. He writes short biographies of Romans and Greeks. He's one source, and there's one source. For example, there's a source named Ephorus, and his account differs a little bit from Herodotus. For example, Herodotus never mentions, but Ephorus does, and there might be some corroboration, was that Leonidas either led or planned a night attack. In those 3 days where they held back the Persian army, Leonidas ordered, or again, either led this raid or had his best men. They infiltrated the Persian camp and they attempted to kill the great king. That account is in Gates of Fire. And when I first read Gates of Fire, I thought, oh, this is also just a fiction line. This was made up by the author, but it has its validity in some primary sources. This guy named Ephorus. There was this poet named Simonides who also wrote poems about all the Persian war battles, and Thermopylae, I think, is in there as well. I mean, there's so many counts. Barry Strauss is a good author. He writes plenty of books. Paul Cartledge probably has written, in the modern version, he wrote a book called The Spartans, right? And that's a good modern historian's account, well read, and fun to read. The author is Paul Cartledge. He's written some stuff. In terms of I mean, I grew up reading historical novels, and that led me to, primary sources and other things. I really find the novel Gates of Fire to be a beautiful
Book.
novel. It is.
Yeah.
It's a very inspiring book, and his other books about ancient history are very good as well. The author is Stephen Pressfield. He wrote a book about the Battle of Thermopylae called Gates of Fire. Then he wrote another book about the Peloponnesian War, which is also really good. It's called Tides of War. He often says that that's actually his favorite book. He said in Gates of Fire, he portrayed men as he wished they were, and in Tides of War, he portrayed men as they actually were. And then he wrote a very good book about Alexander the Great called The Virtues of War. So I mean, if you go to the history section of Barnes and Noble, you're going to find wonderfully entertaining books about all this stuff. It's ironic. And one last thing, I think one of the reasons this battle sticks out as well is never would the Greeks be united as they were at this time. In fact, as one historian later said, all of the later glories that the Greeks won was in wars against themselves. For one moment, right? For one moment in history, all these Greeks were united, right? And that's often as well. Politicians and other folks often mention that, when there's no great danger, people squabble, but when there's some great danger, People are united, and you see people at their most noble, right, and self-sacrificing.
Pressfield, I need to read Tides of War because Dr. Garish, who started us on this antiquity side quest that we're still doing, talked about how Alcibiades was a very interesting figure historically and his
Oh yeah.
side shifting and all that. I do want to read Tides of War. A couple other things that I want to get into before we wrap this thing up is we have to give the movie a grade. Okay, we have to give it a ranking. So I tried to come up with a classical antiquity
Yeah, I
themed
saw the
ranking.
rankings.
All
Yeah.
right, so just so everybody knows, there are five choices. All right, all around excellent movie. That's an Alexander the Great. Surprisingly good movie. That's a Claudius. All right. Good but not great. That's a Pyrrhus. He had his moments, but he wasn't great. I think
Right.
we could all agree with that. And there were certainly generals of antiquity who thought similarly about that. And we don't have time to get into Hannibal's story about that right now. But then an average, so somebody who's not good but also not terrible, Probus, the Roman Empire. I bet nobody knows who that is. So that's why I chose him. I had to dig for a while to find somebody that met that definition. And awful, we're going to go with this not because of his portrayal in the book necessarily, or in the movie or the graphic novel, but because we didn't really get much motivation for why he did this, and he caused the defeat of the Spartans. We're going to go with Ephialtes. That's going to be awful. So sorry, man. This is how you're listed in Herodotus. You get the short end of the stick on this one. So any of his descendants out there who might get mad, sorry. That's how I'm ranking this. So what are you going with?
Well, talking about the movie has made me appreciate it a bit more, right? I was prepared to, because after I saw the movie the first time, I mean, you know, I'm a person who doesn't like Gladiator. I think Gladiator is not a very good movie, and I think
Same,
I'm
bro. Same.
okay. Good, thank you. We are part of the small brotherhood of people who think Gladiator is vastly overrated.
Yeah.
Um, that said, you know what? I I think I appreciate this movie a little bit more talking about it again. I think I'm going to give it a Pyrrhus. It's not great. It has flaws, but I think I appreciate it again a little bit more, right? I think I'm kinder to it again, um, for what it did, and it was an influential movie. And so for what it is, I think it is a good movie. Um, I think you and I again we talk about the battle parts, the battle scenes. I mean, Hollywood seems to just. Even saw the Dune. I like the new Dune movies, and the Dune movie did a good job of finally explaining why they're using swords and things because it just these shields that make projectiles a little bit obsolete. But even in those movies, Hollywood loves their rushing two groups of folks just rushing towards each other with weapons that has no military, very little military value in that at all, right? The whole point um, is to not just go as like a mob of people, right? That's not an army, that's just a mob. But Hollywood loves to have that, um, and they love their individual combat where one person with a sword, just mows through six people. Um,
Like in Braveheart, when they just charge.
yes, and they just run into each other. And I love Braveheart, right? Braveheart is one of my favorite movies, but over time I've realized that some of those battle scenes, um, actually, you know what? There's actually one show that attempted to show what actual good generalship and tactics would do, and that is the Battle of the Bastards in Game of Thrones. Um, they have what's his name? Bolton, Ramsay Bolton's army does this phalanx thing with shields. Do you remember
Yeah.
that? And
Yeah.
although I mean I think George Martin was playing with his military. He was playing around with his military knowledge, And he said, wouldn't it be cool if actually one person held the shield and one guy had the spear? So they turned a phalanx into sort of like a partnership tactically. And with that, they were destroying Jon Snow's poorly generaled army in that. I wish Hollywood would trust the audience intelligence and let them see. Alexander the Great, the Oliver Stone movie tried, I thought did that as good as any movie's ever done it. And those were really good battle scenes.
So,
But again,
yeah,
I think I look kindlier upon the movie now, and having talked about it.
yeah. As far as where I'm gonna rank it, I struggle a little bit because it's so entertaining. I mean, it's just an entertaining movie, and if you just want to have a good time, and I think that's part of Leonidas, spoiler, telling the story at the end to rally the
Yeah,
Greeks. It plays into that. It's like, hey, we're just gonna be here to have a good time, and some of this stuff is just us being here trying to entertain ourselves. Good night, Ada. All right. Love you too, sweetie. So it's something that if you watch, you're just gonna be entertained. And to your point, the slow motion, the action scenes, the fighting are very, very good. The McNulty subplot, I hope this gets somehow on the Wikipedia page, and the portrayal of the Persians, I thought were weak. But if you don't know a lot about the history from that time period, you're probably not going to be bothered by that as
right.
much. Uh, Although, God, if you watch that sequel, it's really weird. So I think I'm gonna go with for this one a surprisingly good and rank it a Claudius.
Okay.
Uh, in large part, I think because of its ultimate legacy. And for a Zack Snyder movie to come in under 2 hours, I got to give you some. I got to give that movie some serious love for that. So on the whole, I mean, I think there's some stuff that they could have done better with it, but it's just something that'll entertain you if you watch it, and if you go in with the idea that you want to be entertained and not really a whole lot else, I think you'll really enjoy it. And plus, the line that, to your point, that was said about the Persians shooting their arrows, I'll read it from Herodotus. It is said that before the battle, he was told by a native of Trachis that when the Persians, I'm going to get words wrong, so don't judge me. When the Persians shot their arrows, there were so many of them that they hid the sun. Dionysius, however, quite unmoved by the thought of the strength of the Persian army, merely remarked, "This is pleasant news that the stranger from Trachis brings us. If the Persians hide the sun, we shall have our battle in the shade." And when that line makes it into the movie, you're like, man, this is great. This is just going to be awesome. Whatever's going to happen, it's going to be awesome. It's going to be fun. So I'm going to give it a Claudius. I'm going to give it a Claudius. Now, with the rankings out of the way, let's get a future podcast topic. I'm going to throw you a curveball. Why don't you give us a future movie review that we could do here on the podcast?
Okay, this is a curveball, but I got one, or I got a couple. All right. What's your thoughts on Kingdom of Heaven?
Have not seen that.
Okay, it's medieval, Ridley Scott.
Yeah, I'm familiar with that now, but yes, I've not seen it.
That's one. I mean, the movies have to be obviously of somewhat, long ago historical nature.
In the antiquity time period, preferably.
Well, we could also do a podcast on old movies from the 50s and 60s, right? When big biblical epics or big historical epics that we would recommend, or what we liked about those films. Maybe we could inspire people to rewatch some of them again. I'm talking about like a Ben-Hur or a Spartacus, Kirk Douglas, Fall of the Roman Empire, Cleopatra, right? The movie that bankrupted a studio, Elizabeth Taylor.
Yeah, she was amazing in that.
Actually, of all the portrayals of Julius Caesar in movies, the one I liked the most, I thought got Caesar's arrogance and sense of humor best, was Rex Harrison. in the Cleopatra movie with Elizabeth Taylor. So that movie again, that movie's budget, I mean, it bankrupted the studio. It was so big. How about that? We could do something like that. We could just go through some old movies which have, they have their flaws, excuse me, as well. There's a very underrated movie called The Eagle with Channing Tatum. Based on a novel that a lot of English kids used to read 80 years ago, The Eagle of the Ninth, right? About a Roman army in Britain. And I actually enjoyed that movie very much. It had a very well done portrayal of the Roman tortoise, the military formation, the tortoise in action. I hadn't thought about that movie in a while, and I thought that movie was wonderful.
All right. I like where we're going with this. I like the Spartacus one, but everybody's reviewed that. I do want to see the Eagle now, but when I looked up, and I would be more than happy to talk about Cleopatra, I did not realize this, that the director Joseph Mankiewicz also had done a version of Julius Caesar starring Marlon Brando as Mark
Oh,
Antony.
oh my gosh, that movie,
Wow.
it's Shakespeare. Some of the most thrilling to me, thrilling Hollywood moments is Marlon Brando, Mark Antony speech. I urge you the movie's worth the 7 minutes of Marlon Brando and his funeral speech for Caesar portraying Mark Antony. It's so good that when when our middle school teacher was having her class read Julius Caesar, I rented them the Prime, and I asked them to watch this. I asked them to watch Marlon Brando give the funeral speech for Caesar because it is amazing. I've never seen Shakespeare, like the cliche, Shakespeare comes alive. Marlon Brando as Mark Antony, and especially in that funeral, the famous, friends, Romans, countrymen, lend me yours. You got to watch that movie. James Mason plays Brutus. It's very good. And again, the best part of that movie is Marlon Brando as Mark Antony. It is, your eyes will be wide open watching that.
Okay, so we've got at least two we can definitely bring you back on to talk about later. But I mean, anything, people today probably do not appreciate how great of an actor Marlon Brando was. I'm trying to remember which movie it was that he was in. It was a black and white movie, On the Waterfront.
Oh yeah.
There's a scene in On the Waterfront where I think it's Eva Marie Saint drops a glove, and he just picks it up and starts playing with it, kind of pulling at it like he's an ADHD kid, and just he ends up taking over this whole scene just by this accidental ad lib that he does. I mean, he is just a tremendous actor. So when I saw that he was in that, when I was looking this up, I said, "Well, that's got to be fantastic." So that is a definite. Okay, those are some great ideas. Anything else you want to say about either the movie 300 or about the events upon which said movie are based?
These I mean, the reason it is an entertaining movie is it's the underlying story behind it. What makes history not boring for students and for other folks is if these things are told as stories. They are stories. People tend to think of their own lives, as a story, a character arcs. These stories from ancient history, I mean, there's a reason some people are big nerds about it, like you and me, because these are wonderful stories. And you can't get much more of a thrilling story than the story of the Persian Wars, the Battle of Marathon. I mean, it has it all. Great politics, great action, heroes and villains, and so the more you read about this stuff, and if you find good writers, this stuff sells itself. and these are thrilling stories. Um,
Well, we can, yeah, and I think this is probably why that your recount of it is probably why this event keeps being retold and talked about. It's just such a compelling story all the way around. And there's a lot of different versions of this out there. Go read the book, go read Herodotus, go read Stephen Pressfield, read this stuff. It's fascinating, and you will enjoy it. It's impossible not to take a lot from this and want to learn more about it. It's just that entertaining. So Victor, again, thank you for coming on. Just so everybody is aware, we are working on some other episodes, getting some stuff lined up. Maybe an episode about a very famous religious cult in ancient Rome back in the day. I'm not going to give too much away, but we're working on that now. And so stay tuned. We're going to try to drop these about once a month. And thank you all for listening very much. You know where to find us. We are on Twitter at AntiquityPod. The website, again, not planned, bullcitycoordinators.com. You can find us anywhere you get your podcasts. Check out our YouTube channel. That is where we seem to get the most traffic. So just go there. And just remember, folks, the Classical Antiquity Sidequest is a podcast without end.